Hello and welcome to the webinar number 40 of the Zebra BI webinar series. I'm Andrej of Zebra BI, and today I'll present some must-know tricks for interactive Excel dashboards. All right, we'll try to build a fully interactive Excel dashboard with some cool visualizations with interactive features like slicers, all based on pivot tables. It's going to have a couple of pages, all with links and so on. So, we'll try to build it today from scratch. Okay, I have some demo data, and I'll try to show you tips and tricks how to build it in an hour. Okay, so the agenda for today, this is going to be a 60-minute session, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. For the introduction, I'm just gonna show you basically what we are going to build, and then we are gonna build it, okay, together. Also, I will show you how to get started with the Zebra BI visuals for Office, which is a free add-in for Excel to help you build interactive Excel dashboards, but also ad hoc analysis, prototypes, reports, visualizations, charts, tables for slides, and so on. All right, and in the end, we'll share some resources and download links. Have a interactive Q&A session, and yes, we will send you the recording. We're recording this, so the recording will be available starting from tomorrow on. All right, so I'm Andrej. I'm the CEO and founder at Zebra BI. I'm Microsoft Most Valuable Professional, and also a HEHERT IBCS certified consultant. Okay, and today with me I have Mark, who is helping me preparing the webinar, also monitoring the questions, and he will make sure to answer a lot of your questions, I hope. Mark, are you here?
Yes, hello everyone. So yes, as usual, I'll be taking care of the questions along with our other BI members, and yes, keep them posting, and see you at the end.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. So just keep your questions rolling in, and we'll answer it, some of them, during the webinar, and some of them in the end. All right, now let's get to work. All right, interactive dashboard in Excel. Let me just share first what we are going to build today. Okay, this is my dashboard. It's a sales dashboard in Excel that has a couple of slicers. So it's a sales dashboard that has a couple of typical sales KPIs like revenue, gross profit, then maybe costs. All right, and as you can see, as a user, of course, you would expect that an interactive Excel dashboard, of course, is fully interactive. That means that you can slice and dice the data. You can change the value of your filters in your page, and then if you change a value of a filter on one page like this, and then go check out some details in another page, like for example here I have maybe my top 15 or so countries here, but then I want to see the details from my dashboard. I can just navigate to my next page, and then of course see the details for the same month, and then have the options to dive into details, drill down into more rows, and so on, and then go back to the landing page. We have talked about the best practices for building dashboards, mostly in Power BI, but now today we're going to talk about the same topic, but in Excel, right? So I would just say that, you know, from the design point of view, all the best practices are somehow are basically the same. It's just a conceptual structuring of your pages, of structuring of the whole dashboard. Like we always recommend that you have a first page that is typically called a landing page. All right, so this is the first page that your users will see, and of course they want a typical user would want to see their main KPIs, their metrics, most important metrics, somewhere on the top or top left of your dashboard page. Okay, so this is this area where I have my revenue, costs, gross profit, maybe some other KPIs, and of course compared to plan, maybe compared to previous year, right? Also, then have some time series to understand, you know, the trends. And then a couple of breakdowns that actually explain, you know, the achievement of the target. So actually explain the performance. So why is my revenue, you know, it looks good, it looks green, and even though the costs are also slightly above the plan, actually for 4.6%, right? My gross profit is still in green, which is all good, right? So that's fine, but still I do have some countries here, like for example Australia or United Kingdom, where, you know, the situation is below the plan, and, you know, so I can take action now. I can take a closer look at certain countries, drill down into details and understand what's going on. All right, so we will try to build the whole dashboard from scratch, and the technique that I'm going to use today is simply I will just use pivot tables. All right, pivot tables and a couple of things related to pivot tables, like slicers, and we will learn how to synchronize those slicers, how to use certain tips and tricks to make sure that your dashboard works across several pages, that, you know, everything runs smoothly, everything is designed in a nice way, and yeah, we'll see how to add things like you know, choosing multiple values in slicers, how to add navigation, hyperlink navigation from the homepage to detailed pages, and so on. All right, so this is of course not the only way how you can build interactive dashboards in Excel. Of course, Excel is such a flexible tool. You can use many different types of techniques, like you can use formulas, dynamic formulas like offset plus match, or VLOOKUP, XLOOKUP, and so on. But today we will focus on pivot tables, because it's, I would say, probably the best way to build interactive dashboards in Excel, and it's also most, I would say, convenient and the most robust way of doing it, because if you can get your data into pivot tables, this means that you have cleaned up a little bit, at least your data sources, and you probably have a, you know, a good structure of your data somewhere in your pivot table, and you can also connect directly from Excel to a certain database, which can be basically anything. I mean, it can be an export of your data, let's say export of your sales data from your ERP system or something else, right, into a file, and then you load it into a pivot table. You know, from Excel, which is the most basic way, right? But you know, even better, you can connect directly to your source system, which can be basically anything. I mean, there are practically no limitations in Excel to connect to any type of database, including analytical databases like Power BI databases or Azure analysis services and so on. So you can use pivot tables that work with Power BI data sources and things like that. So let's start with a completely empty file. The only thing that I prepared in advance is, this like a frame of the page, and then I have some source data. In my case, this was an export from a sales system, and we applied some transformations here. Maybe in the end, I will also talk a little bit about transformations, how to actually prepare or clean up your data sources if time permits, right? But this is now my demo data, and this is my empty page. All right, so first of all, before I even start working here in Excel for the first page, how do I actually determine the size of the page? All right, this is it's a trivial question, but still, is it just random width, times random height, or do you have some sort of a system, right? So I would definitely recommend just sticking to 16 to the ratio 16 to 9, which is why I have a rectangle here, which is just a simple rectangle in Excel. But this rectangle here, the size of this rectangle is 18.96 and times 33. And how did I actually get to this number? So this is exactly 16 times 9, and the easiest way how to get those numbers is actually from PowerPoint. All right, so for example, if I share my PowerPoint, can I do this just real quick? Let me see if I can do it from my existing PowerPoint, right? So if in PowerPoint you go to the design, you have the slide size, and you see here you have standard. So this is the old 4.3, and now 16 to 9 is now the standard size, widescreen size that also corresponds to most screens out there today. So if you click here on custom size, you will see that for the widescreen, which is 16 to 9, this is now the exact width and height in centimeters. All right, so you can just use those numbers, right? This is the best approximation to determine the size of your pages. Yeah, right. So so typically I would start with a rectangle, empty rectangle with the right sizes. All right, now I'm ready to add some content here. All right, let's navigate to my source data and we'll insert a pivot table. All right, so just insert a pivot table from this table, and I will put this pivot table, put this pivot table in my home page. So let's just drop it here somewhere. All right. Okay, so this will be my first data, and what I'll build now is this little table with all of my KPIs. All right, so this is why I have a dimension or a data field here called the count, I think. Yes, so let me move this to my rows in my pivot table. And then also I have a couple of measures. So I have my actual values, and I also have my plan values, but then I also have a forecast and previous year values. All right, so I was actually able to manage to bring all of those values into my source data, so I can work with those. But let's start just with simple actual to plan comparison of my KPIs. All right, so now I have my pivot table. And all right, it's time to insert the first chart or a first table out of this. So let's go to insert, and now I will insert the Zebra BI tables visual. Okay, I already have it here in my recently used add-ins. Okay, but how do you use the add-ins in Office? If you haven't done this before, just navigate to Insert and My Add-ins. And okay, so well, for the first time, you just simply click on Get Add-ins. All right. Obviously, I've done that before, but if you're a first-time user, just go here and search for Zebra. Okay, and you'll see two add-ins, Zebra BI Tables for Office, Zebra BI Charts for Office. So both of those visuals are free for personal use. Okay, this is the best news. And then the second good news is they work in Excel and in PowerPoint. Okay, so I'll just basically just add both of those visuals, right? Click continue, and then you'll have them. Okay. So for the free license, simply continue with the free license. That's it. Okay. Now I have all of my KPIs, my revenue, gross profit, and cost visualized. Okay, and compared to my plan. All right. So because this is a plan, I basically have two columns here. All right, two measures, actual, and the second one is actually a plan. So that's why I will click here. Under the gear icon, you'll find some settings for the visual. This one is connected to my pivot table. And as you see here, you'll find your values inside. And I'll just move the second one into the plan bucket. Okay. So this is because Zebra BI is, can actually distinguish between typical business scenarios like previous year plan, forecast, and so on. So you can always move those measures into the right bucket to get the right labels and so on. Of course, if you don't like those labels, these are the standard or I would say recommended short labels that are recommended by the IBCS standard. That stands for International Business Communication Standards. So that's why you will always see in Zebra BI, you will see always those short two-letter abbreviations. If you need to, for some reason, change it or have a different terminology, you can simply rename them here. All right. Okay, so this is now my very first table. This will be somewhere on the left. When you're moving your objects around in Excel, right, and building your dashboards, it is important that you also know how to align things. I mean, this is the trivial thing, right? But if you put one object here and it'll be like I don't know, 7 pixels too much to the right, and 3 pixels higher than the next object that I will put here, right? It will look ugly. Okay, so the alignment is a very simple design principle. Just make sure to align things on your dashboards. And one way how to do it in Excel is that when you're moving the object around, press Alt. So the press Alt on your keyboard and then move it. Okay, and what this will do is it will align the object to the underlying grid in Excel. All right, to your columns and rows. Okay, so basically this is moving. This is just regular mouse move. Just stretching it and so on. But if you press the key, the Alt key, it will snap to the columns, okay, and rows. All right, so this is how you basically align your objects, and this will just allow me to quickly align things here on my dashboard. All right. Okay, now if you need to sort certain elements, like in my case, I would actually prefer if my revenue is on the top and so on. There are a couple of ways. Of course, you can try to sort this in your pivot table, like ascending, descending. You can add custom sort in your Excel options. That's also one option, right? And then the simplest one is you can just simply in any pivot table, you can just click on like the right edge of the cell here and move it up and down. Okay, so this is just manual sorting. Just move it up and down in the table. And now I have my revenue, my costs, and then gross profit. Okay, let's say it's like that. Okay, all right. Now, however, this is now for what? Is this for January or is it for February, for each year, and so on? Okay, now I actually, in my data, I have data for 4 years, right? So I have my date field, and then I also have my year and my month field, which is here my source data, right? So basically it was, I had my date and I just extracted the year by using the year formula, right? Basically, if you need this, you just type year, oh, sorry, not like that. Basically just year, from your date, right? And that's how you get your year, okay? So obviously I did this before, so I don't need to do this again. And for the month, you can use the month formula. So I already have my year and my month as a separate column, okay? And this is, you will need a separate column, not just a date, if you want to build nice and user-friendly dashboards, okay? So I do recommend that you use year and month. All right, so now how do I add a filter for year and month here? I want to have this selection here on top left, right? So how do I do it? I mean, I can add my year and my month into the filter of my pivot table here. So the year and the month. Okay, maybe first year, then month. Okay, and now, of course, I can filter it here like that. But I want this, right, filter to be actually here on top left. So how do I do this? Okay, so let me show you one trick. What I'll do is I will now copy and paste, just copy, paste my little pivot table here. And this time I will just use the filter area, okay? I don't need the data. I have the data here, but here I just need a filter, and then I'll move this filter to my dashboard page. All right, so that's why I'll just remove everything else from this pivot table. So basically I have like a miniature pivot table here with only filters. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll just cut this, move it here on top like this. Okay, so now I have my pivot table that only consists of my filters. But of course, now this is a copy of a pivot table. It will not change the values in my pivot table here, right? So you see, so now I change it to my next month. Here I still have May values. All right, so of course this is not working, but I would somehow need to synchronize those two pivot tables, right? Make sure that this filter actually filters this pivot table. How do you do that? The answer is very simple. You can click on any pivot table, either this one or this one. And by the way, I also recommend one thing quite strongly, okay? every pivot table that you have, and basically every object in Excel, when you're building your dashboards and reports in Excel, make sure that you give them, nice names, legible names that people will understand, and basically you will understand, after a couple of months when you will open your beautiful dashboards, and then, so that you'll understand what is what. So let me just rename this to like call this month year filter, right? And this would be my, instead of pivot table 1, this will be my APIs, maybe like that. All right. By the way, the Zebra BI visual is now connected to this pivot table, and because I have renamed this pivot table, I just need to check this. So see here, because my Zebra BI table is connected to this pivot table, you have the data source here, and it's listed pivot table 1. Okay, so this is still the old name, right? Unfortunately, Excel does not send the rename events to other objects. So if you do this later on, make sure that you actually have your objects connected to the right pivot table. All right, so, but to come back to my trick, okay, how do I now synchronize those two pivot tables? Through or via the slicer. Okay, so click on one pivot table, go to insert and slicer. All right, now what Excel will present, it will present all the data fields that you have available, potentially available for your pivot tables. Okay, so this is not just the month, the year, and the KPIs or account data field that I have here in my pivot table, or not just month and year from this little pivot table here, but you actually see all the underlying data fields. All right, because pivot tables in Excel, they have a thing called pivot table cache. All right, when you inserted the pivot table in the background, Excel actually has all the data fields that it found in your source data, right? And you can actually use any of them. Okay, but in my case, I will use the year and I'll use the month. Okay, and I'll just simply insert year and month slicer. All right, now let's check out what's happening now. So now I have a slicer for my month. If I click on, and this, I still have May and June here, so I click on March. Okay, because I inserted my slicer from this pivot table, this slicer now controls this pivot table. And if I move it to August here, okay, my slicer has synced, okay? So, but this pivot table hasn't synced to this value, right? So that's why we will right-click on the slicer, go to Report Connections. All right, and now you will see a list of all the pivot tables in the whole workbook that you have, and you will just simply tick the pivot tables that you want this slicer to control. Okay, so I need my month year filter to change and my KPIs pivot table. So this is this one. When I do this, all right, now everything is synced. Okay, so basically the slicer, you can just sort of think about the slicer as the synchronizer of multiple pivot tables, which is really nice. And this does not work only within one worksheet. Okay, this works across the whole report. Okay, so we'll get to that a little bit later. Okay, so now let's check this. May, June, you see, it doesn't really matter where I change the slicer. Now I'll move it back to June. and it's June here, everything has changed. So this is the first like technique that you can use to synchronize your data. And also here, right? So I have year 2019, and here I have 2022. So also with the years, I need to set my report connections, make sure that the year slicer actually also filters this pivot table. And yeah, then I will already have some pivot tables for the next worksheets here. Okay, we'll use them later on. All right, now this is set up. Now this also works 2000 like that. Okay, good. So this was the first, very first technique. Meanwhile, you have seen that the area of my report here has changed a little bit. It's not anymore the size of it. It's not anymore the same as my rectangle here. This is because this pivot table that I added here has actually changed automatically, changed the sizes of the fields, right? Like this or like this. Okay, and the pivot table, when pivot table refreshes, it by default changes the width of the columns, okay, which is something that you probably do not want in a page here, right? You don't want this pivot table to change your dimensions of your report, right? So that's why, yeah, you can just right click, go to pivot table options, and then you have a couple of things that I typically set. So the first one would be this one, right? So this is the auto fit column width on update, right? So just disable this, okay? And now from now on, whatever happens, this column and this column will just stay exactly the same no matter what happens with your pivot table, okay? It will not change the dimensions of your report, okay? All right. Okay, let's add another pivot table and build a couple of more charts for this dashboard. All right, I will just do it. One more thing maybe here. Okay, so now since my month slicer and year slicer are already filtering this pivot table, you don't really need the month and year in the filter area of this pivot table. So even if I now move those year and month out here, okay, and now set this, to June like that, you see the numbers will change. This slicer is still, of course, filtering my pivot table, even if you don't have your month and year here in the filters area for this pivot table, okay? So whatever is hooked here as whichever pivot table is hooked here on the slicer will always filter it, no matter if this field is actually in the definition of the table somewhere or not, okay? Always filtering, which is good, which is what you want. Okay, now what I'll do is I'll just take this pivot table and just copy and paste it, okay? It's much faster to just copy and paste your pivot tables for, another table or a chart or something else that you need in your dashboards and reports. That's the fastest way. Of course, I could have gone back to my source data and again, click insert pivot table, move it there and so on. But, you can always just copy and paste. It's faster. And then remove those KPIs here. Instead of that, I will this time use my month. Okay. Now I have the month of June. Okay, why? Of course, because I have made a copy of this pivot table that this slicer is already filtering, but this time I actually want all the month, okay? Because now I want to draw a chart for all the month here. I want to get that trend. Okay, so in this case, I will make sure that, okay, first of all, let me rename this as I said. So this will be like monthly table, something like that. Okay, and now I'll go and make sure that my monthly pivot is not filtered by my slicer. I don't want just July. I want all the month here in my monthly pivot table. So uncheck this. All right, now I should have got. So this pivot table is now like independent of the slicer. I will always have my month here, and now I'll use this one and insert the second Zebra BI visual, which is called Zebra BI Charts for Office. Okay, so this is the second add-in. Continue with the free license, and voila. Okay, now I've got. Now you have a couple of options now how to draw your line. Well, first of all, this one, okay, this one is being filtered also by the year slicer. Still, that's cool. Again, I have my actuals and my plan here. So let's move the plan here. So yeah, this would be your typical situation, right? When you have monthly values up until a current month, and then from the current month onwards, right, you would have the rest of the year where you only have the plan. Now the Zebra BI add-ins for Excel also support more complex scenarios. So now you could be able to add like the forecast as well. I think there are quite a few options here. So let me move the forecast. So if you do have a forecast, this is a much better view, right? Because now you don't have just the data for all the history and you're always looking back at your performance. You also have the forecast until the rest of the year, right? Like this one. And, and then you can actually see how you're going to end your year in the end, okay? So now the changes here are very, very small in my data, right? So that's why I just cut the axis just to see this a little bit. Yeah, but so it's, additional information. If you add forecasts to your dashboards, they will become more valuable. All right, and yeah, you can even add the previous year. So that's also an option. Now I'd have to move it. Yeah, I would have to change it basically. So my forecast, plan, previous year value, actual value. All right, now this is already getting a little bit crowded, but now you have all the important information. So you have your sales, 1.4 million in January, right? Then you have your difference to plan, all right? So this is 120K above the plan, and then this little triangle here is the previous year value, right? And then for the rest of the year you also have the forecast, and then the forecast is compared to the plan. So it looks like for the rest of the year our forecast is actually lower than planned for all the month. That's not a good situation, but yeah, that's how it is. All right, so this would be now the Zebra BI charts. Okay, let's just put a chart like that. Okay, now let's add some more data. What else? Let's add some more details, like a breakdown by country or something like that. Again, I'll just simply copy my pivot table. So it's always the same technique. You basically just copy your pivot tables, throw out the fields that you don't need and just add the fields that you do need. So my country goes here in rows. Now I have all of my countries, the values, the actual values, and plan values. And all right, so this is like a breakdown by country. And now I'll visualize this again with the Zebra BI tables. Add in for office, continue with the free license. And now you see it, right? I mean, the added value of visualization is, if you just compare this to those numbers, here you don't see anything. You don't have a clue, which one is the biggest, how big, what is the, are you achieving plan for certain country or not, and how much, and so on, right? So nothing is really visible here. But as soon as you drop this into Zebra BI visuals, right, this will become quite apparent. And it does not really matter. I mean, you can have a very large table, and then you can simply sort, and then also the end users will sort. In the end, you can just share this file via Office Online, Office 365, or share the file and so on. People can simply click to see who are the fastest growing, what are the most important countries, how are they compared to the plan. So let me put this to the plan bucket, right, like that. And if you make it more narrow, you still get, the same information, only in a slightly more compact form. So basically, you just need to make sure, to drop your objects to the right place. And now for things like this, so like for the first page in your dashboard, I would typically recommend not to display too many things on the very first page, like this page, the home page. What's going on? Okay, the first page, should really be a quick glance of the performance. How are we doing compared to certain compared to plan and so on, and the breakdowns and the most important information. So that's why on the first page I would also recommend to enable a couple of filters. All right, instead of having all of those countries here, and do the drill downs and everything here on the very first page, okay, I would just limit this to like a top, let's just say top N, for example, countries. Let's just have like 15 countries. Okay, and that's it. So you basically just need your most your top countries. It's the 80-20 rules. You will have the most important data here on top, sorted to make sure that the first, second, third, fourth row are really the most important ones that people will see, and that's it for the first page, right? So of course, if people will want to now understand, okay, what's going on in the UK, for example, why is this below the plan? Okay, of course, now you need to build something else. Okay, what will you build? You will build a new page, a new detailed page, and make sure that people can actually navigate from the first landing page to the details, to the page with the details. Okay, so what I'll do here is now I'll just copy my pivot table here. I'll just copy it to my next page, like here. Let's go home here, and yeah, and now on this page, I will add Again, I'll just copy my pivot table. And this time, I'll drop more information into my pivot table. Much more, actually. So I'll just drop my countries and then customers, right? So it's a lot of information here, and insert a Zebra BI table. Okay, and now, if you get this error with the table, with the pivot table, then one thing that you need to check is whether this pivot table is in the so that's under design. In the report layout, make sure that your pivot tables are in tabular form. Okay. So this the Zebra BI visuals work best with the tabular layout of pivot tables. Okay. All right. So now what I've got is my the plan, and now I have, you know, my countries, and then I have all of the customers below the countries. It's a lot of information. Okay, and this is now good because it's on the second page, you know, where people will actually click to get to a lot of information. You can have it collapsed. Like on the first level, only see the countries, and now, okay, what's going on in my United Kingdom? Open this, and you know, I'll see all the details here, all of my clients. And then even if this is too much, you can then on the second level, if you here right click, you can actually also set like the top, bottom, and to the customer field, right? So you can actually now select, because you have two fields, you have this hierarchy in the table. You can select this and apply the top filter. Let's say, I don't know, top 10 customers in each country, right? Now you get this top 10 customers plus others. All right. So you see these others here. And this is an interactive element, right? So the Zebra BI visuals are completely interactive. So it's like very visual pivot tables on steroids, right? You can expand, collapse things, you know, add the slicers, add filters, and then when you have the filters, you know, the end users can actually just click and they will expand certain rows. You can change the order of columns by simply dragging them. People can sort by different criteria and so on, right? So it's very flexible, and it's all just out of the box. Okay, let me change the zoom back. Okay, and of course with tables like this, you would typically have more comparisons, right? So maybe here we can also make this table a slightly more complex. So I'll actually add my previous year as well. So this would be a more typical. Okay, and I'll get back to my pivot table, back to my Zebra BI table, and now you have a lot more columns. Now you have the previous year, you have the plan, and you have the actuals. Of course, you can move them around. So previous year, actual, plan, and then you have all the variances that are being automatically calculated by the visual. Okay, so here you see in my pivot table, I don't have any calculations like that. I don't, you know, I don't have the growth rate versus previous year. I don't have actual versus plan variance and so on. I just have the numbers, right? What Zebra BI tables visual will do, and also all the Zebra BI visuals actually, they will calculate all of those variances on the fly and also make it completely interactive to explore them and so on, right? So you have the absolute variance and the relative variance for all the comparisons to plan to previous year. And I can structure your reports. You can do it like this, or sometimes I like to do it in the following way. So I move my plan actually way back as the last column, and then move my actual in the middle. And I think this works nicely because now you have the previous year, and then you have the variances to the actual. So now previous year, growth from previous year, and then your actuals. And then on the right side, you have the plan and comparison to plan. Okay, so this is, how you can do it. And then, of course, you can then also add some design elements. You can add some slight borders if you want. Like that or so, but try to keep it actually minimal and functional. Of course, you can change anything. You can change, of course, the colors. Of course, the red green can be problematic for people with color deficiencies. That's why we have here even some styles that are already optimized for people with color deficiencies, or you can simply choose custom style and then just choose any kind of color that you want, right? So whatever works best in your scenario. All right. Now, now a couple of things to finish this off. All right, we need a couple of more things. First of all, I want to add a choice. Where do I have it? To actually select the KPI. So this little element here, when you can, when the user can simply flip from revenue to gross profit to cost. All right. And then we also have a nice waterfall chart here. So, all right, this is still missing. Okay, back to my work in progress. How do I add the slicer for my KPIs? So it's this pivot table. I will insert a slicer and select the account dimension. Okay, the account dimension is actually the field with my KPIs. All right, so this is now my slicer. Okay, now it is filtering. It's filtering actually this one. It's filtering this pivot table, but not the other ones. So first of all, I will just make sure that to check the report connections. So this one, I actually do not want to filter my KPIs here. I'll just have all the KPIs always here, but this slicer here should filter my monthly chart. So this is my monthly pivot table. And then, okay, now I didn't give it a nice name. So I have pivot table 4. I guess that those are my countries. You see the value of giving it a nice name. Month year filter is this one here. So this is okay. So this one and this one should be filtered. All right. And also, look at this now. Now I also have pivot table on my next report. Okay, so this is the one that I have built. Only I'm not sure which one is it now. Is it this one or this one? One is the filter and the other one is the big table with countries and customers. Okay, so now you'll see that this filter will filter, this slicer will filter all the pivot tables across multiple worksheets. Okay, and this is the beauty of this. It'll filter everything. Let's check this now. Okay, I thought it froze on me. All right, something is going on. Oh no. Oh, my Excel crashed. Okay. That's terrible. Unfortunately, let's check. Was it this one? Work in progress. This is the most recent. Whoa. Okay, I hope it's this one. Let's see. Unfortunately, Excel sometimes does crash. Okay, hopefully this works now. Okay, so this one, just select all. So I have this, and now, okay, it's working. All right. So this is working now, and we will just now design this slicer, right? Because I had this horizontal slicer, and now my KPIs are listed vertically here. With the slicer, you have so many options to actually design it in a real nice way. First of all, you have the number of columns here, and in my case, I will put this to 3 columns. All right. So now I have my elements here. Okay, so this is already nice. Then next thing, you have the slicer settings and a couple of things here. So I actually do not need the header here, so just remove this. I just quickly sort descending so that I get revenue here. And also the other thing here is you might want to tick the hide items with no data, like if you have some blank rows or something. If you enable this, hit OK, now all the elements that don't have any values will be simply hidden. So this is like the most clean slicer, and then you can have it here, and now this filters everything on the page. Okay, now this slicer, you can design the slicer. First of all, you have a couple of predefined styles. So this one is like very clean and most minimal. But if you want to design it in your own way, like for example, if I wanted to have it like a Power BI style with black buttons and so on, then what you need to do is you actually take a style, right click, and then you say duplicate. All right, so you basically duplicate the style, give it your own name, like my slicer style. Okay, and now say okay. So now you have your own style. Make sure you click on it. Okay, so now you have selected your own style. And now when you right click on this style, you can modify it. Okay, so you need to first duplicate it, because you cannot change the default styles that are shipped with Excel. But once you have the duplicate, you can now set anything, like for example, selected item with data. So this is my revenue, which is selected right now. You just click format, and I can basically do anything. I mean, for example, you can have the black buttons, like black fill, and then because the fill is black, you need white font on top of that. All right, okay, and you see, so that's like the drill. Yeah, I would recommend to just get rid of all the borders and so on. Just make it as minimal as possible. So this file will be shipped once we ship the recording. We'll also upload the file, so you can just explore how it's done. We already have some styles that we have used in this file. All right. The last chart that I would like to add here is a chart where I display all of my business units. So this is the last thing we'll do now. I will now throw out the account and use the business units. All right, or actually maybe group of business units. All right, so these are my most important business units. And yeah, how to build a waterfall chart. Just do it with the Zebra BI charts for Office. Click. Okay, and now you have all of your business units. Again, this is my plan, so I'll move it to my plan bucket. Okay, so now I have, all of my business units. This is, the waterfall chart that shows like the total growth here, 3.5% and so on. And this is now the contribution of each business unit, to the plan. So this is one way how to do it. Now, because those business units, so the charts with horizontal axes are more suitable for displaying time series because these are now my business units. This is not really a time series, right? So it will be better to actually turn this chart around for 90 degrees, and you can actually do that in Zebra BI charts for Office. You have this option here called Show Vertical Axis. Click, and now you have your waterfall chart, like a vertical waterfall chart, with a vertical axis. And again, now you can put it here. All right, put it in like that. Okay, of course, now I would need to align everything neatly and so on. So I would need a couple of more minutes, but yeah, that's basically the technique. And then, okay, the last thing actually is the link. How do you put some sort of navigation here? So maybe the last trick here. So you can just go for a text box. So what I'll do now is I'll use a text box and I will insert a symbol like an arrow like this one. Did I insert it? All right. Make it slightly bigger. Or actually, not the text box. Let me change this to like a circle. This would be probably nicer. Circle with slides, something like this. And just make sure that everything is aligned here and the shape should be exact circle. So okay, let's do it like this. All right, and now I'll just use this. This is just a simple shape, right? But you can use it. I can put it here, and you can use it as a link, to the next page. How do you do that? You simply insert a hyperlink. All right, so you insert a link, and now you just navigate here to the place in this document, and you simply say report 1. All right, click. Boom. Yeah, okay. This is it. I was surprised because the colors are completely different, but that's my report. Yeah. All right. So you see, that's how you do it, and then you basically just then you could just copy and paste it and use the same one. Just change the link to all the pages. So here you would then put it here. Maybe turn it around. Whoops. Turn it in the other direction and change the link back to home. And now you have the navigation. All right, click back to home. Details. Home. All right. Okay, guys. I hope that I've given you some ideas how to use pivot table slicers and the Zebra BI visuals to build dynamic dynamic Excel dashboards. Please follow us on social media. Also, I would definitely recommend, let me just show you. So to recommend you to head over to zebrabi.com and make sure to navigate under resources, because now this was already webinar number 40. If you just go to our webinars page, you will find all the webinars here, with lots of other tips and tricks for Excel, for PowerPoint, and for reporting and actionable reporting in Power BI. You will also find helpful resources like, the knowledge bases, crash courses, how to get started, and so on. So there's a lot of information, videos, examples, and so on. Plus, we are shipping a Zero BI Academy that is going to be completely free in basically in a week. Okay, so make sure to follow Zebra BI on LinkedIn and subscribe to YouTube channel so that you will get notified.